Hello and welcome to this episode of Trash to Track. In this episode we're going to be looking at this Bachmann J39 Loco that again is one of Will's locos that he sent in for repair. Having a look at this model, the detail pack isn't opened and it looks to be in very good, almost mint condition, although Will's has said that it's a non-runner. Again, bought unseen from an auction. He's told me it's completely dead. Like I said, looking at the model, it is in generally very good condition. There's very few marks on it, and there's just one broken handrail knob on the cab side. So we're going to give it a battery test and see whether or not we can coax any life out of this locomotive. So I put it on the track there, normal battery test, and you can see there it was just trying to move. But unfortunately, it doesn't appear to be doing anything else. Initially, it did try and creep along, but there's something obviously not right with this model. It's not showing any signs of shorting out, so we better crack it open and have a look. To remove the body shell on these, you need to remove the rear screw under the cab, and also remove the screw that holds the coupling in place, and then the body shell simply lifts off. These are small Phillips head screwdrivers, and this is a Bachmann early Bachmann split chassis model. So removing the body shell eventually, it is a bit of a tight fit. There's a little clip at the front there that engages with the body shell, but you can see it generally looks to be in very good condition. So I'm wondering whether or not there's a short circuit or something that's stopping this from running properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to upend the model onto its plastic part, and holding the plastic I put the battery on the two halves of the chassis, and you can see there that the motor is turning very slowly. So I removed the two screws underneath to remove the wheel keeper plate and the chassis keeper plate, and I can see that the wheels there are the normal split chassis ones, although at this point I've not seen any evidence of the axles breaking, although once I took the wheels out it becomes apparent that the rear axle has actually split and the wheels are loose in their axles. This is becoming a common repair at this run of Trash to Track locos. This must be the third one I've had with this problem. Again, the middle cog there, that's all split as well, and then there's this signs of this horrible thick sticky grease that we've come across before. So I try and remove it with a cotton bud of methylated spirits, but to no avail. This stuff really is stuck on very well. So this could be the source of why the motor's not running very well. And as you can see here, this axle, this has had it. This is totally split, and it's no good. This is fit for the bin. So I'm going to have to get replacement axles online and replace the axles. And that one there just split into two without any effort from me at all. It's just a very common problem. It's a shame because some of these older models are very nice, and without the know-how they just sit in boxes and run for years until somebody comes along to repair them. That's totally had it. That's no good at all. So while I wait for the replacement axles, I'm going to give the wheels a clean up with the cotton bud of methylated spirits. Clean the nodule there that goes into the axles, and also clean all the wheel backs just while I've got easy access to them. On one of the backs of the wheels there's the remnants of super glue that I had to scrape off with a scalpel blade. This axle has obviously been glued in the past, which is why it wasn't very easy to get out of the axle holder in the first place. So that's all the wheel backs and everything cleaned, and a few days have gone by and the replacement axles have turned up from Peter Spares that are 3D printed again in white plastic. So we're going to open this little bag up and reassemble the wheel set. It looks a lot better than the axles that I actually got for the haul I did several episodes ago, and these are a very tight fit, so you just put the axle on. It doesn't really matter on one side, it matters on the other side though when you get the quartering correct, but we'll come to that later on. I'm now going to crack the chassis open by removing these three screws, and we'll see what's going on in here. These screws fit into plastic moulded insulating parts, so just to remove them with a small Phillips screwdriver, and then the two halves of the chassis come apart to reveal the motor and the contact springs. Although this seemed to be stuck together. I had to actually get a flat bladed screwdriver and gently prise this chassis apart. I've never come across this before. But when I opened the two halves of the chassis up, there's the dreaded green grease that we've come across before. And this really had set almost solid. It was on the worm gear, the bearings, and all these gears here. Very thick, very gloopy, and it's going to take some removing. You'll see in a second that I can barely turn this cog with the end of a screwdriver. It's almost glued into place with this horrible glue. So everything here is going to need a thorough cleaning. And from previous experience, this is going to take some getting off. As when we did the Great Western pannier tank, I needed a lot of hot water and a lot of patience. But I start by rubbing the majority of the thick grease off with a baby wipe. And then I wash all the parts in warm soapy water. Both halves of the chassis and all the cogs and insulating pieces were given a good thorough cleaning in hot soapy water with a toothbrush. The chassis base plate wasn't too bad, and this was cleaned up with a methylated spirit soaked cotton bud, just to remove the dirt and fluff that had accumulated on this over the years. You can see now just how clean these cogs have come up, but that was almost an hour's work. The same with these two chassis halves. Now that I've left them to dry for a couple of hours, I'm going to start reassembling these. Even after all that cleaning, there's still some of that green grease on there, which I've just removed. And you can see there how much freely that cog turns on that spindle. So replacing the cogs to the spindles, I'm now going to add some fresh lubrication on them. There's still some of this green grease over the motor casing, but I can't really get this off. I do my best, but obviously I can't immerse the motor in hot water. So that will have to suffice as it is. Doing a battery test on the motor shows that the motor is actually very strong and powerful, and the grease hasn't penetrated and seized the motor. So like I said, I'm going to put some fresh lubrication on this now because everything on it has been washed off. I'm going to put a small amount of oil on those gear spindles, followed by a small amount of silicone grease that I apply with a cocktail stick. And you can see now just how easy those cogs turn, whereas before I could barely turn that with a screwdriver. Now that they've been added and lubricated, I'm going to add a tiny amount of oil to the motor bearings. And then the motor sits in place back into its holder like this. When you do take a split chassis loco apart, ensure that you don't lose the connecting springs. That is very important, as if you lose them, they're quite hard to replace. The worm gear bearing support there is also pushed in place. And then, as I said earlier, a small amount of silicone grease with a cocktail stick is put on the worm gear and on the drivetrain. I just remove the motor there and I add a small amount of grease to the end of the worm gear, the part that rests up against the bearing in that plastic housing, just to aid lubrication and running in this model in the future. Now that the lubrication's been applied, and there looks a lot there, but it isn't. When it spreads through the drivetrain, there's not really a lot of lubrication, and I didn't have to wipe any excess up off this model. I replace the spring in the other half of the model and then gently line the two halves of the chassis up, ensuring that the bottom mounted insulating pieces are sitting correctly in their die-cast slots on the chassis. And then I screw the two halves of the chassis back together. Again, do not over tighten your screws, as these plastic insulating pieces can be brittle and you really don't want to break any. Now that's done, I'm just going to give the chassis a quick battery test there, and the motor spun lovely. So it was just a case of that grease had seized the motor and gear train up solid. Now it's time to reassemble the wheel sets, and I did this by having one set of wheels at the 12 o'clock position, and then positioning the other side wheels at the 9 o'clock position to give the correct quartering, and they were put in back into the chassis, and these will only go in one way and one side, as you have the mechanical lubricator arm to screw onto the chassis there. Some conductive lubricant was put onto the wheels there, as there are no bearings in this model. The wheels simply run in the chassis block, and the chassis plate was replaced and then screwed back in securely. Holding the model with the plastic pieces, you can now see that the motor and wheels run lovely and freely. You wouldn't really believe that that amount of grease could cause such a lot of problems, and that may be worth investigating if you have one of these models of your own that is a poor runner. I'm just going to add a small amount of oil onto all the crank pins and linkages, just so that it's well lubricated when it comes to being used in the future. I had one of these J39s as a child growing up, and mine actually shorted out and burnt the motor out, and I wish I still had it, as it would be an ideal candidate for track to track. I'm really hoping it still lurks in its box in my dad's loft somewhere. Turning my attention to the Loco body shell now, I just give this a quick dust over with an old makeup brush, and I'm going to repair that broken handrail knob on the cab side there with a small amount of Loctite superglue. That is all that's required for repairing the body shell. To replace the chassis into the shell, it's a simple case of engaging that front clip and then pushing the chassis into place and then securing it with the screws we removed earlier. One in the rear just under the cab footplate, and one in the front that also secures the coupling in place. One final battery test while the body shell's on, and it's like a different model. This model really is running nicely now. So as I said, I'm just going to repair this cab handrail, and to do that I'm going to put a tiny amount of super glue onto a cocktail stick and then apply that with the base of the broken handrail knob and then hold it in place until the glue has set. Once the glue is set, I'm going to turn my attention to the tender, and all that needs is a dusting over. Using the tweezer nose pliers there, I just hold that handrail knob in place, and like I said, until the glue sets. Using a very small amount of super glue reduces the risk of any white bloom, but it needed super glue with this. No other glue would hold that securely enough. Inverting the Loco now and putting the battery on the wheels, I'm going to give the wheels a good clean up first with the fiberglass pencil to polish the surfaces. And I clean all 6 wheels, as all 6 wheels on this model provide pickup to the 2 halves of the chassis. Once I've finished with the fiberglass pencil, I polish the wheels and remove any residue with a cotton bud soaked in methylated spirits. And you can see there on the end of the cotton bud just how much dirt is coming off these wheels. This will be like a brand new model when we're finished with it. I'm already over the moon with how it's performing, and we haven't even tested it on a layout yet. So now, like I said, I'm going to turn my attention to the tender, and all this needs is a good dusting. It's got a few years worth of storage dust on it, and the wheels have tarnished and have got some grime on them, so I'm going to give these a polish up too. These were cleaned with the same method as the Loco wheels, but instead of using the fiberglass pencil, a cotton bud with mess was sufficient just to clean the non-powered, non-pickup tender wheels. So that's this Loco rebuilt and overhauled, and all that horrible thick grease has been removed. So I'm just going to give it one final battery test, and it's running nicely. So I went upstairs and put it on James's DC train set on a few wagons and gave it a good running in for half an hour, as I don't know when it is the last time this engine actually ran. If you've got a Loco you'd like to see featured on a future episode of Trash to Track, please email me with the email address on screen, dansmodelrailways@gmail.com, and we'll have a look at getting it sent over, and who knows, it may feature in a Trash to Track episode all of its own. Thanks for watching another episode of Trash to Track. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye for now.